Hello, everybody. My name is Natalie Geeden. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Impetus Digital. At Impetus Digital, we have built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools. We have worked with life science companies from across the globe over the past 13 years to help them with everything from creating digital advisory boards to virtual medical education to investigator meetings, online programs, and everything in between. And since the launch of our award-winning Insight Events platform, we've been helping pharma companies with MSL and sales training, corporate events, innovation hackathons, and all kinds of wonderful virtual engagements. But more importantly at Impetus, we really believe that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations with some of the leading edge thinkers, digital provocateurs, and healthcare thought leaders, we can all work together to collectively and positively disrupt healthcare. So I'm super excited about having one of these healthcare thought leaders at the table with me today. This is actually Samuel Circe. He's actually the CEO of CliniStart. He has a Doctor of Law in International Business Transactions from the University of Tulsa and is a former North Carolina state senator. He has expert knowledge of clinical study startup processes on an international basis from the US, EU, and the APAC region. And it also includes contract and budget processes. And as a former founder of another leading pharmaceutical services company, he has extensive contract research organization, or CRO, pharmaceutical and drug development experience. Sam created the Global Fair Market Value Compliance Program at the world's largest CRO. And there he also served as a global contracting account director for strategic partnerships with the top 5 pharma companies. Welcome, Sam. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Natalie. It's great to be here, and what a wonderful introduction.
Absolutely. A very interesting background, from a state senator to working in a CRO company. What the heck was going on over there, Sam? Like what was driving your career trajectory, and how did you land where you are today?
Crazy. It's a crazy story. So let's back up a few years, about 10 years. So I had just started work in the CRO industry. I've worked for 2 large global contract research organizations. We had just landed a large study with a pharmaceutical company that was going into a very massive phase 3 global study. What we realized at that CRO is we needed help with the contract and budget negotiation team on a global scale, not just in the United States and Canada. So I was sent over to Europe to assess our capabilities in the region, and we realized we needed to really build that team up. So we took that team from a team of about 10 people to 110 people over the course of 2.5 years. So we really grew that team of people very aggressively, but we were very successful in that approach. So we created groups of contract and budget experts across the world through what we called a hub system in some of the key regions and key cities of Europe and the Asia Pacific. And then decided that it could become its own business, really, because that was sort of that specialization in contracts and budgets and really helping the sponsored drug companies get through the study startup phase faster. That was the idea behind the first company, which was way back. Gosh, it's hard to believe now. It was sold back in 2016. I entered sort of a 4-year non-compete period. And then re-entered the industry as soon as that non-compete was up in March of 2020, which, as we all know, was right when the global pandemic started. So in between those 2 companies, I did run and twice won election to office. I was in the state Senate here in North Carolina, representing the southern part of Wake County. So it's a unique set of entrepreneurial skills with also healthcare policy. From a government angle. If there are questions sort of involving statewide policy, I'd be happy to handle those a little bit later in the conversation. So that's sort of how we've gotten here to today, where we're at. And so CliniStart is a tech-enabled services company. So with the first company that was very similar to what CliniStart does now with the contract and budget negotiation piece, we did not have a true focus on technology. So with this company, we started with the tech and then backed our way into the solution. We started with the problem statement and then backed into the solution. And what we created really was not only a wonderful management tool, but a workflow management tool. And it was built on top of the Salesforce.com platform. We love that platform because 98% of the companies that we worked with were already on the platform. So that was really a pretty easy transition for us. It's a trusted platform. People know who they are. So we built a very, very niche product that is only for clinical trial contract and budget management through this system, which is only not only a people management system, but a workflow management system. And so through this tool and our network of expert negotiators across the world, we deliver these services. And that's why we like to say we're a tech-enabled services company.
Beautiful. So you mentioned something really important at the beginning, Sam, and you were saying the company started initially because due to a problem statement.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of experience with pharma sponsors, clinical research organizations trying to do clinical trials. Now you were doing this before COVID. So what was the problem statement, or what were some of the difficulties or challenges that these various organizations were running into as trying to do clinical studies?
That's a wonderful question. So something that we run into over and over and over again, you'll hear about study startup. Anyone who's been in the industry more than 12 months has heard something about study startup. And we've looked at it thousands of different angles, I feel like, as an industry, but the rate limiting factors of study startup tend to be the contract and budget negotiation process. So our thought was, okay, if we can create the technology piece to help make us more efficient in that role, and also hire the best people to provide the service, we feel like we're speeding up clinical trials because our core competency lies in that contract and budget negotiation skill layered in with the technology piece, gets us through the study startup process faster. And I think there is no better example of that than the pandemic. I mean, when all the vaccine trials started coming out, it was unbelievable how quickly we were getting studies up and running. Now, granted, a vaccine trial obviously is very different from a rare disease trial, right? Because you can basically recruit whomever to take the vaccine. So the recruitment piece was easier, but I think we're still sort of looking as an industry and analyzing how quickly we were able to get studies up and running and asking ourselves, why can't we do that on everything? Why can't we be that quickly with a rare disease indication or another cardiovascular study? And so that's an area of focus that we're still looking at. And kind of a trend, I think, in the industry, we're starting to see companies, not necessarily just like ours, but similar to us, hyper focus on one area of the clinical process, get extremely good at it, and then be able to add value through those services.
Yeah, 100%. I love what you were saying. And, clinical study startups, unfortunately, like you were saying at COVID, there was actually a moratorium, almost like a closure or stoppage of many studies that just completely threw the industry into it was a complete debacle, and they were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. Now, we oftentimes think of the bottleneck, if you will, is what you were saying earlier, which is really around patient recruitment. Now, you bring up something that's really interesting, which sometimes people may allude to being a little bit dull and boring, and nobody really thinks about it. But we don't really think about contracts, amendment negotiations as being something that anybody does or even considers. Tell us a little bit about what that means. What is happening there, and why is that such a crucial step, and what some of the challenges have been around contract negotiations?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because I think we get so excited behind the science of a new compound or a new idea or a new gene therapy, whatever the situation is, that you're right. We do sort of forget there is the paperwork that still has to get done, right? There's a way that we do things. There are ways that and processes that we have to follow. And that's never going to change. We're always going to have a contract. You're always going to have a budget with every clinical site out there. And I just think that, again, we're starting to see the rise of niche service providers, some without tech in the space. But I do see a trend in the industry moving toward, I guess you would call it a bit of a fragmentation or deconstruction of the clinical trial way, sort of system as we know it, where maybe one large global CRO would handle everything. I think we're seeing companies now use a number of different providers to get things done, but they're still relying on the CRO for the core clinical component. So that is one thing we've definitely seen.
Absolutely. So, so important around that whole paperwork, just getting things started. And I think another core competency, and it's again part of the process, it's dull and nobody thinks to do it, is really around budgets, planning, for the development costs. And more importantly, sometimes even the investigators not quite seeing as transparently what the costs are for them to participate in the clinical trial. And this is all part of that whole contract negotiation and who owes what and what have you. So what is your service and your platform help sponsors, CROs, and then even the investigators in this whole process around budget development?
Sure. So the bulk of our work is on the front end with CRO and sponsor clients. There is a segment of the company that's wholly separate that does handle site level work. We still see a use of two major platforms throughout the industry for that budget creation process. But when what we see in the industry is with biotechs, I mean, the budget is mission critical because you often have a company with, 2 or 3 people, right? Some biotechs with promising therapies, and there's only a certain finite amount of funds available. So we've got to make sure that those budgets are as accurate as possible, as realistic as possible. Sometimes that means having conversations with clients that budgets are a little too low heading out the door, and making sure that we hit that sweet spot where we're able to recruit sites and then ultimately recruit patients.
100%. Another core piece, a part of the clinical trials that we don't oftentimes consider is always about, and it should be all about the patient, is somehow there's money transfer that's taking place. And when we talk about budget development and the cost to participate, there has to be some payment that's going to these investigators. So what is CliniStart helping in this regard?
So aside from doing the contract and budget piece on the front end, we also handle the site payment piece on the back end. So there have been the emergence over the past few years of a number of really significantly good and improved platforms upon which to make site payments from. 5 or 6 years ago, those didn't exist. And we're still seeing a lot of fragmentation in that piece of the business, but that's probably one of the fastest growing areas of growth that we're seeing in our company, because there's a tremendous focus on being able to make those payments globally. Some regions will require those payments quarterly, sometimes monthly, sometimes in the US or Canada, we even want to see weekly payment. So that variation and understanding what that landscape looks like, and then assessing the best technology tool to implement those site payments, I think is critically important, because nothing makes a site more upset than them performing clinical work and then not getting reimbursed or paid for the work that they're putting in.
100%. You also you alluded a little earlier to the CliniStart Catalyst SaaS platform, so your software as a service platform. You said it was built on the salesforce.com. You said lots of people were using this already. So what have you already built into the system? What sort of workflow automation have you integrated so that people who use your company and your services, you're sort of streamlining the kinds of work that was oftentimes considered manual?
Sure. Well, so we talked about the problem statement earlier, right, of just the complete inefficiency of the contract and budget process. I would say a secondary problem statement that maybe you don't hear a lot of CROs talk about has to do with reporting. So typically in most organizations, you would have 2 computer screens open, right? You would have your Microsoft Outlook on one, and you would have whatever your systems or whatever your CTMS, your main clinical data aggregator, up on the other screen. And so as you're performing contract and budget negotiations over here, you're supposed to be updating CTMS in real time or whatever system's being used on the other side. There's a huge gap. And we know that as people are doing the work, they don't necessarily update the systems that feed into reporting that then goes to the sponsors that allows everyone to know where we are in this process and where the timelines are going. So what we did is we took the Outlook itself, the Outlook tool itself, because that's the main tool that we use as contract and budget negotiators. And we created a button, Salesforce button, that you just select, and it records all the iterations of emails that are going to and from the sites. All that versioning control is there. We have templated responses that cuts down on the time of the negotiator having to actually type a manual email to a site. All sorts of efficiencies built in. We can even build it in to remind a contract negotiator every 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, to follow up with that site. And those reminders are then aggregated into reporting that moves up to the management level. So your managers are then able to just quickly look at a dashboard, tell, who has 5 sites they've got to move with today, or they're a day behind, just to keep things on track and to keep things pushing forward. So I think being able to integrate that, all those workflows into a technology tool has made that piece so much more efficient.
Now, many sponsors, CROs, et cetera, will have their own workflow. A lot of times it's sort of a customized approach. I was curious as to the scalability of this approach when you have to technically customize those processes by sponsor or clinical study. What is your company doing around the scalability question and the any other interoperability questions?
So whenever we have a sole providership with a client, that's ideal, because we're able to build upon more and more efficiencies as we move forward. So let's say we have a client that has a program of 10 studies. We're able to then clone those agreements as we work with the same sites over and over, meaning we just duplicate the language is done. Then we know exactly what the budget points are that we need to hammer and get negotiated, and we're done as quickly as possible. So just to say that the more studies that we do with a specific client, the more efficient we become. Now, we also have a very consultative side to our business. And I'll go back to the biotech example, where sometimes you can have a very small company with 5 or less people, but a very promising trial upcoming. Those are instances, I think, where us being able to draw upon our global expertise, we're able to then help the client down the right decision-making path. And I think that's critically important, because sometimes clients may have an unrealistic expectation of a timeline or how hard something could be. And I think that's where we have to be very open and honest and upfront in the planning process. And we sort of do all of that by having a large kickoff meeting and, hammering out what the ground rules are and what the processes are going to be.
In terms of your product and services, how flexible is CliniStart on that? So depending on some CROs or sponsors, they've got lots of staff, they're very familiar with your platform. They basically just want to use a license for your software, versus others that you just mentioned, which is, kind of a skeleton crew, kind of green at this. Maybe they're new in a therapeutic area and they need some assistance in that whole process. Does your business have that kind of flexibility about just going through the SaaS license versus, the whole managed services? And how do you provide that?
It does. And we find that one feeds off the other. So if we have a company that is licensing a product, often they'll inquire later about the services, or people that are using the services who automatically get the product because they need the dashboard to log into to see where things are, get interested in using the product across their whole study startup platform. So the two work well with one another.
Absolutely. So you were mentioning about your customers, that normally your focus and who you're targeting is really sponsors or pharmaceutical or medical device, life science companies,
right,
clinical research organizations, and you have another arm that's dealing directly with the sites. Who else is part of your stakeholder base or target audience, and what exactly is your business model?
So you pretty much named the foundational elements of our business, pharmaceutical companies, the sponsor side, but we've seen a huge uptick in what I would call mid-sized CRO customers who have decided, okay, we're not going to build this contract and budget negotiation team yet. We're going to keep growing our clinical business and outsource that function. And I will say I'm a little surprised over the past year how that piece has grown. Because we've seen CROs in the past be so protective of every service level offering in the clinical process. So that was a little surprising over the past 12 months to see the openness of smaller and mid-sized CROs really open to the idea of outsourcing functions within what they do. So I think that's a good mix. And then, of course, the site side is a mixture of sort of site management organizations and then sometimes independent site networks. That tends to be the bulk of that business side. Independent sites are by themselves fairly rare unless they have a pretty high volume of studies that they're handling at a time. And that's what makes everything scalable on the sponsor side and then on the site side.
So do you charge as a subscription for the platform and then, an hourly rate for the services piece? What is your pricing process like?
Right. So we would have a regular licensing fee for folks just interested in the software product. For our services, we operate on what we like to call a flat fee. So a fixed cost for fixed scope is what we typically say in our pitch meetings. So those are flat rated. And part of the reason for that is because we know how fast we can work on our end. And when you're able to give a flat rate for a service, I think it just allows the client better decision-making capabilities up front, particularly with budgeting.
100%. Yeah. So, and since that's a core component of what you provide, you guys are very aware of that whole budget contract negotiation piece. So let's actually talk about, these benefits to the CROs, sponsors, the sites, these people that you're targeting. What they're going to start working with CliniStart. So there's, the problem statement, there's the way things were done before, the inefficiencies, what, and then they start working with CliniStart. So do you have actually metrics and perhaps studies to show the advantages of working with you and what you bring to the table?
We do. And in fact, because the system is built, the central system that we use, the way that it's built, and the way that it aggregates data, we're even able to dive into that and split it up by therapeutic area, region, country, however we want to look at those generalized turnaround times. I think that's very helpful to the client base as well in the planning process when they're getting ready to take on some new clinical studies.
Fantastic. Yeah. So we're seeing, obviously major advantages of faster start times to the studies, shorter time to market, doing things like lowering costs. Those are things that are going to be very attractive to companies. So with all of that said, there's the pre-COVID and then the world went upside down. And I'm sure, clinical trials saw kind of their death kind of right in front of them. And then we moved into this new world order, if you will. So decentralized clinical trials, patient reported outcomes, ECOAs, all these new kind of technologies and ways and things and methodologies. And then we're talking about, smart tools and 24-hour glucose monitors and smartwatches, all these things are going on and being built into clinical endpoints and the way things are happening. How has it impacted CliniStart? What are you doing differently? And how has COVID impacted your business?
Wow, that's a lot to unpack there. I think, let me first take the piece about the technology and sort of wearable devices. I mean, that obviously changes a little bit of the contract verbiage, depending upon whom is the manufacturer of the medical device that's capturing the data, so on and so forth. So it can complicate the contracting process a little bit on the front end. How has COVID impacted our business? Well, as I said at the beginning, we literally launched the month that the world shut down. So it was March of 2020. And so we knew initially we had this technology product that needed to be built. So for us, we just went into a very conservative posture because all of the clinical trials had basically come to a halt there at the beginning. And so we worked on the tech piece and really got that piece right. And then what we saw toward the end of 2020 was a thawing of the holds. Now I would say we're starting to see a few sites shut back down with the Omicron surge, but nothing like with the Delta surge. And we're still working through a backlog as an industry of studies that were put on hold in 2020, even though we're in the year now, 2022. It's hard to believe, but there's a tremendous amount of work. And quite frankly, CliniStart was well positioned to win a bolus of that work because it put a stress, it put a pressure. We keep hearing about supply chain economics or supply chain dynamics. That sort of applies to the clinical trial world as well. It's
100%.
just a service-based supply chain that we're talking about instead of a physical supply chain. And it's the same pressures.
Yeah.
We're seeing a tightening of the resource market. As more and more work has come in, you're seeing more open positions. We've seen some people make huge career changes with the great resignation, as it's called, and some people have gone out on their own and started companies. So it's a fascinating period to be involved in clinical trials, and I think the impact COVID has had on our industry and indeed our whole society, those are going to reverberate those repercussions for years to come.
Absolutely. It is a very, very interesting times, that's for sure.
Right.
Impact that CliniStart has had or has seen on things like, with the clinical projects that you've been doing is like, have you seen things like improvement in site performance? Are you seeing an increase in things like availability and also patient retention? Has there been any impact on that at all?
I would say yes, yes, and yes to your question. I think we've gotten better as an industry at identifying high performing sites. And I think we're constantly looking for those clinically naive sites that have the potential to also be high performing. So some of our co-relationships, I guess you would say, or sole providerships with other companies in this space deal with site selection. And so that makes a good partnership from our perspective, because we're working directly with companies that handle site selection. Then we can help them get up and running as quickly as possible on the study startup side. So I think, yeah, just all kinds of changes, things to focus on. And again, we'll be dealing with it for years to come, good and bad.
Yeah, and then actually, there's a lot of people, agencies, providers, vendors that have all been chasing after sort of the digital space. We've seen lots of winners, some losers, but most people moving into the digitization of all things medical, including the widespread usage of telehealth. I was curious about what CliniStart is doing or has been doing or will be doing around potential partnerships and integrations of these types of technologies and the ways that you're helping people to manage their clinical trials.
Yeah, well, certainly instances like this webinar via Zoom or LinkedIn Live, these kinds of platforms have created an environment that I'll just say internally for us as a company, like many companies, negates the need for physical office space. We do have physical office space, but it's fairly small. And we've seen a huge push, and I do think our industry was kind of first, so to speak, with the work from home idea, but I don't think it became fully embraced until March and April of 2020. And I think now it's almost not even a question anymore. And I think that's just one of the major changes that we've seen in the industry, is that flexibility and this idea of the workday is not really 9 to 5. It's just sort of when the work gets done, as long as it gets done on time or ahead of schedule. And where that work gets done from is also not as important. And I think that any technological advance is making that more and more of a reality.
Yeah.
I mean, we
Huge.
saw a lot of people, we still see people moving. We're based here in the Research Triangle Park, but we've seen a tremendous influx of folks, especially from California, from Silicon Valley, just as again, those reverberations continue to go through our economy and our industry.
Right. It's just a fascinating thing, this great dispersion, along with all the other great things that are going on at the same time. So I think it definitely will be studied for years to come. I'm also just curious about what is the differentiating advantages of CliniStart versus the many other people that are jumping in on the bandwagon of trying to provide similar services. Now, this is going to be potentially a hodgepodge of opportunities and people, and you could end up getting into a place where you can even be working with the same client, and one division is using these people and another division is using these. Have you run into that situation, and what is this world going to look like? Do you see an amalgamation? But ultimately, what are you providing that's different from others?
So I think to talk first about what do we provide that's different from others is just that tech-enabled specialization, to be able to have those global experts that understand the contract and budget piece, but then to layer in that technology that we built specifically for this on top of that, I think just makes us completely so much more efficient that it's not even really competitive, if we're talking about how quickly another organization can get up and running. I think that's been a huge push, and we'll continue to see what happens there. And as the technology keeps getting developed, because as we all know, software is never done. It's always a work in progress. We get more and more efficient. Now, where we see some disconnect, to take kind of the second part of your question, on for clients, for example, that we do maybe contracts and budgets, but we don't do the site payments, or that we do the site payments, but not the contracts and budgets. I think when we're working with other providers there, it's just another layer that you've got to be very well aware of. And I think that building reminders into our software platform helps to mitigate some of that risk, if you could call it risk, working with other companies like that. But we just want to make sure none of those fundamental foundational aspects of startup fall through the cracks at the end of the day.
Do you foresee there becoming eventually the Amazon or the Google or the Metaverse of what you're doing? In other words, do you see like a Teladoc, big, huge conglomeration wanting to buy up, multiple companies to start integrating and creating this seamless single interface? Is that a possibility, or do you think that at the end of the day, CROs, site sponsors, they're really preferring their own specific choices?
I think it is a possibility, but I think we also, as an industry, we constantly see insourcing and outsourcing, insourcing and outsourcing. And so what I'm curious to see, and we're still watching, is post-pandemic, do we continue to see these wild swings? Because I think that, talk about how quickly we were able to get some trials up and running through a decentralized approach, is going to have an impact for years to come. We've already seen many successful companies here in the Triangle that take a completely decentralized approach. That's going to affect the way that we recruit, the speed at which we're able to get studies up and going. And it's just, I think, creating a more efficient system overall. But yeah, there absolutely could be one company that rises to the top, that just does it all and gets it right, from the start. I think right now it's still pretty fragmented. And we see that through the merger and acquisition activity still in the space. It's very active.
We're really running into a world of complete patient centricity. And we've always talked about it, but I think this is a completely different animal. It really does revolve around the individual, the patients, both nationally, internationally, et cetera. What are you seeing around trends of where the patient fits into this? And do you eventually see one day patients perhaps crowdsourcing clinical trials that they need or want? What does this look like in the world of the patients in the future?
So I think one thing that really happened between my 4-year hiatus, right, from 2016 until 2020, a huge change that I noticed is this idea of clinical research care or clinical trial care as a healthcare option. That may have existed, and someone may have enunciated that prior to 2016, but I don't remember hearing it prior to 2016. And now we see organizations known as IROs. That's really what they push. It's all about the patient. It's allowing these clinical trials to make healthcare accessible, sometimes in populations perhaps where that accessibility did not exist. try new approaches to recruitment. I think it just holds a lot of exciting possibilities, but I have absolutely seen a tremendous focus on the patient. I think prior to 2016, it was safe to say it was very much a focus on the sites. And that's still foundationally important in the recruitment process. You've got to have the right sites, the right clinical sites, but a massive push toward patient experience and patient recruitment. And then again, just that idea of clinical research as a healthcare option.
So kind of projecting a little bit further into the future. Also just wondering around what we see clinical trials being in the future. And that is, will, for example, everybody technically, since they'll all be connected through the internet of some sort, as we start to think about software recognition and facial recognition and ambient biometrics and all the tools and things that you're doing, and your houses becoming and your cars becoming these smart sensors. Do you think that all of us will be in some sort of a clinical trial of some sort? And what do you think that will look like?
I think that's a distinct possibility. I think you'll see options. I mean, it could almost come down to almost to an app on your phone, whether you want to opt in, opt out of a certain clinical study with basically a boilerplate agreement in place. All kinds of things are possible. I think even what we define as a site is already rapidly changing because we're starting to see, for example, urgent care centers or even a retail pharmacy store. That can be a clinical site, especially in a vaccine trial. So this notion of sort of old school, we used to think of a site as having to have certain types of equipment, and it was a physical spot, and the patients come in, and that's all changing very rapidly, as you've mentioned. I mean, through wearable devices, through technology such as Zoom, webcams, telehealth, it's all changing very rapidly.
I absolutely love what you're saying. This is a segue to my last and final question. And futuristic thinking is that we are going into the N=1 world, and the idea of digital opinion leaders now is changing. You're saying sites are changing to the point of a patient could eventually become a site potentially. And so I was also just curious about if you had any thoughts, and you may or may not have knowledge in this, around blockchain, around ideas like decentralized autonomous organizations. You are talking a lot about contracts and this concept of trust, and being able to execute certain things before a payment is made. Are these kinds of technologies that your group and others are going to consider that starts to really automate a lot of this stuff that you're already physically doing?
We are seeing some of this, and let me talk just a little bit, kind of hyper focus on sort of the cryptocurrency movement. So when we work throughout countries that are lacking in clinical infrastructure, I mean, a lot of African countries, for example, very difficult to get sites up and running because you've got to build so much of the physical infrastructure to recruit the patients in the first place. But I think when we look at blockchain, when we look at cryptocurrencies and the ability to make payments on a site payment sort of side even faster, instantaneously, without the need for a bank account, physical bank account, I think that holds a lot of tremendous potential, to the point of, as the data comes into the system, the data captured, payments could potentially be made in real time. So as services are collected and come in, those payments are going out in real time to the site for the services and the work that they've performed. So I think that site level piece has tremendous potential.
You could eventually even reduce, to be honest with you, CROs and sort of the middlemen, because you can go directly to the patient. And if people are just, their data is being accumulated and used and referenced and researched, those DAOs and those smart contracts, those those Oracle chain links and what have you, can really execute the money to the individuals where their data is coming from. And this could potentially be the next futuristic universal basic income for individuals, as robots and whatever take over like physical work, and we all start living in the metaverse, and you're basically getting paid to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely possible. Our avatars could be taking clinical trials, treatment in the future. Who knows?
Oh, we could probably go on with this for hours, Sam. It's actually kind of fun, and we're just all playing in the world, right? So,
Right.
for anybody who's interested in talking to Sam to find out more about how they might be able to partner with their group, learn more, have some discussions, please take a look for his contact details in the show notes below. We also want to let you know, if you're interested in this conversation, check out impetusdigital.com. These are the kinds of conversations we have with physicians, payers, allied healthcare providers, investigators, patients, when we can actually work with you through a series of asynchronous, so not real time, and then synchronous touch points using our platform so that you can actually move the needle ahead, plan your clinical trial protocols, determine how you're going to be doing work and moving things ahead. And these are the kinds of things that we actually do with people through impetusdigital.com. So check it out. We'd really appreciate if you can like and subscribe to our channel, and please leave us some feedback on iTunes. We'd really, really appreciate that. We want to thank everybody for their time today. And thank you, Sam. This was a really outstanding conversation.